Moving isn't ever easy, especially not at 35. After spending years in a bustling city filled with noise and chaos, it hit me. Maybe it was time to take a step back for a while. Recently, I had gone through a separation, and I knew deep down that nothing less than a radical change would suffice to heal the wound left by such a life-altering event. So, I decided on a quaint little neighborhood just on the outskirts of a major city, an idyllic little spot that felt almost perfect to me. It had calm streets, a tight-knit community, homes that weren't ostentatious by any means, and a couple of parks where I could jog along the winding paths without encountering too many faces. I found everything I was yearning for. At first, everything unfolded just as I had envisioned. The air was cool and tranquil, offering a peaceful sanctuary from the stress of my previous life. For the first time in a long while, I slept soundly, free from the shrill cries of sirens or the ceaseless buzz of traffic. My new neighbors appeared friendly enough, waving from a distance and leading their own busy lives, which suited me just fine. I relished my solitude. Ultimately, I sought only peace. However, after a few weeks, something peculiar began to gnaw at me. The behavior of one neighbor in particular caught my attention. He was an older gentleman, somber and serious, the type who rarely ventured beyond his door for conversation. Ever since my arrival, he would watch me from the corner of his eye, almost as if he were gauging each of my movements with a meticulous scrutiny. At first, I dismissed it as quirky, but as days wore on, it became increasingly impossible to overlook. From my living room window, I had a perfect view of his house, particularly his small front garden, where each night he would methodically place an old trash can at exactly the same time without fail. I noted that every morning, without exception, there was a new bag tucked inside that can. A tiny, neatly tied bag that the man would retrieve promptly at dawn. It's not something one tends to notice at first glance, but each morning, when I stepped outside for my run, I witnessed this curious routine unfolding. I regarded him taking the bag into his home, and it was clear to me this wasn't typical garbage. It felt intentional and oddly significant. His actions, I realized, appeared to be part of an elaborate ritual, executed with obsessive precision. Initially, I presumed it was just another eccentricity, something typical among older folks in a cozy neighborhood. Perhaps he had an unusual method of receiving mail or some peculiar delivery system that made perfect sense to him. After mulling it over, I set it aside, though something about that bag, the exact way he handled and lifted it, stuck with me. Day by day, this strange practice became an irritation in the back of my mind. Each time I glanced his way, my fascination deepened. My intrigue spiraled further when I discovered that, no matter how many times he performed his ritual, it felt like an act of utmost importance to him. He moved with the urgency and concentration of a surgeon. It became apparent that speaking to him during this critical daily moment could disrupt something integral in his carefully constructed world. As time dragged on, what began as a mild curiosity morphed into a pressing need. I found myself sitting in my dimly lit living room, almost holding my breath, eagerly anticipating the moment I could witness those same motions play out, again and again. I even abandoned my running schedule, preferring to linger in the shadows of my living room as I waited for his nightly appearance. One particularly early morning, however, the scene was different. The light in his kitchen flickered on, a sharp contrast to the typical darkness surrounding the neighborhood at that hour. In that moment, I spotted him standing at the window, his face etched with attention I had not seen before. I leaned closer to the glass, eager to capture whatever detail I could. To my shock, I saw him gripping the bag, trembling in a way that spoke volumes about his inner turmoil. He shifted back, taking glances furtively as if fearful of unseen eyes. Then, the moment took a chilling turn when he abruptly pulled the curtains shut. Why did he act as if he were concealing something critical? My curiosity swelled. I decided that come dawn, I would uncover the mystery. I set my alarm, rising before the sun and pouring myself a coffee, my gaze planted firmly on his house. I anticipated another day of watching his routine unfold without him noticing my vigilant eyes. But as the minutes ticked by, I observed his behavior shift. Now, before he picked up the bag, he scanned both sides as if wary of surveillance, even casting wary glances toward my living room window. There was no longer any doubt. He had become aware of my scrutiny. I had to avert my gaze to evade an accidental confrontation. Later that day, under the cover of night, I hatched a plan. Slipping over to the trash can at the corner of the street, I placed a couple of bags beside it, feigning casual indifference, only to discover that the very next day, the exact same bag reappeared in his bin, perfectly positioned as before. It felt impossible, but I couldn't shake the notion that he hadn't been the one placing it there, lending a new layer of intrigue to my already obsessive investigation. Unable to shake the haunting allure of this growing enigma, I steeled my resolve to stay awake, eyes glued to that garbage can from the corner of my window, intent on unveiling the truth before dawn approached. I half welcomed the madness swirling around my anxious impulses, my gut twisted with anxiety as I wondered if I was laying myself bare before an unseen threat or another world altogether. The chill of that night lingered in the air, and finally, around 3 a.m., I saw the figure I had feared and pursued. The earlier darkness seemed to deepen as he moved in a way that sent icy shivers down my spine. He clutched the bag tightly and, like the night prior, placed it gingerly in the neighbor's bin. Once finished, he paused, scanning the area to ensure no one was watching, a sense of urgency radiating from him. After he vanished, I slipped out of my house stealthily, careful not to create any noise, but a small panic surged to life within me as I followed him into the silent streets of the neighborhood. His movement was deliberate, as if he were intimately familiar with the hidden corners where shadows danced. The chase continued through several blocks until he suddenly veered into a dimly lit alley. My own pace quickened with curiosity and dread as I stopped short before a rundown house I recalled seeing abandoned since I moved in. Heart pounding, I drew in close enough to witness him pull out a key and unlock the door. The figure vanished into the gloom, and I was left feeling exposed and fragile under the weight of the night. Even though every part of me screamed to flee, an insatiable curiosity tugged at my conscience. I walked forward with trembling legs until I was face to face with the house, feeling as if I was creeping deeper into a forbidden realm. Faint yellow light filtered through one of the side windows, and I leaned in, praying I could discern something through the grimy glass. What I witnessed was overwhelmingly chilling. My neighbor sat hunched before an old wooden table, hands trembling, face eerily pale. Before him lay a bag strikingly similar to the ones he discarded nightly, yet it was ajar, revealing a strange assortment of crumpled papers and odd little trinkets. With disquieting meticulousness, he began to remove each item. Photos with faded colors, some underlying layers stained beyond recognition. Fragments of clothing and finally, a small wooden box. I watched in horror as he pried it open, revealing what looked like small hand-cut strands of hair tied together meticulously with string. He handled them reverently, as if they were something sacred. Something dark, perhaps even ghastly, passed between him and those nameless figures held within those clippings. Suddenly, a dull thud echoed behind me. I turned my head, and everything in me froze. The figure I had been tailing for so long now stood less than a foot away from me, their eyes void of warmth. My lips parted in an attempt to speak, but the words caught in my throat, paralyzed by the icy fear clenching at my insides. "What are you doing here?" He stared blankly with a flat voice that dripped with menace. My legs threatened to buckle beneath me, but I gathered whatever courage I had left and managed to muster a response, inching backward as my feet stumbled on the sidewalk edge. The words escaped me. A sudden rush of terror took their place. The figure didn't say a word, extending a hand toward me that felt more like a threat than an invitation. I quailed, heart racing, when a voice emerged from the house. It was the neighbor, his startled gaze equally filled with apprehension and fury. "Leave it!" he shouted, stumbling out of the back door. "This has nothing to do with you." Before I could draw a breath, the shadowed figure slipped back into the darkest depths, vanishing as quickly as they appeared, leaving my neighbor gripping my arm with a wild look of distress. "You shouldn't have followed me," he whispered urgently, voice cracking under the strain. "What's going on?" I questioned, the confusion evident in my tone. But the weariness etched across his face held secrets, and I could see it weighed heavily upon him, as if he, too, were a prisoner of this neighborhood. "It's best you don't know. Just head back home," he cautioned, avoiding my gaze. "Forget what you saw tonight." I stood speechless as he moved quickly into the refuge of darkness, disappearing into the shadows of our peculiar community. My legs felt heavy, filled with unshakable dread. Yet somehow, I made it back to my home. The earlier calm I craved felt utterly distant, swallowed by an unsettling awareness that I would never be the same again. If you are enjoying the stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I moved to this building without much thought, seeking refuge from a life of chaos, a failed relationship, and a barely there job. The colonial Willow Creek house I now inhabited was filled with creaky floors and its stories whispered in the walls, something I found strangely attractive. The surroundings seemed scattered yet welcoming, with modest gardens and a pair of sturdy, old oak trees gracing the streets. My neighbors offered simple greetings, and while I barely knew anyone, the atmosphere was oddly secure. But tranquility was fleeting. It all shifted when one Saturday morning, sipping my first coffee as sunlight streamed through my kitchen window, I caught sight of a moving van parked in front of a house that had been vacant for nearly a year. I tried to shake off the premonition looming at the back of my mind. A man emerged from the driver's seat, his dark hair tousled. His casual attire, a faded jacket tossed over jeans, initially struck me as nothing out of the ordinary. I watched curiously as he and a couple of movers unloaded boxes, tossing them carelessly into the house. But it wasn't long before I realized there was more to this neighbor than his unassuming exterior. Days rolled by, yet amid the hum of normal life, I noticed that this newcomer seemed to avoid any interaction. In my neighborhood, it was common for neighbors to extend a friendly hand upon their arrival. But this guy, he just vanished inside, powerfully detached from the community. As time unfolded, an echo of worry rattled within me. The first night I heard odd noises coming from his vicinity, thuds and scratches that pierced the midnight quiet. I rationalized it initially, imagining renovations in progress. Yet as the noise became more frequent, mounting dread took root within my thoughts. It grew alarming when one twilight evening, I returned from a grocery run only to find him in his front garden, snipping away dead branches with a rusty old saw. And when our eyes met, a startling chill enveloped me. Those pitch-black pupils held no kindness, only a warning, as if he knew I had been watching him. Weeks passed, and something else hung in the air. A peculiar odor wafted over each time I passed his house. It smelled like chemicals mixed with something far more unsettling, like wet earth and decay. I brushed it off as mere exaggeration, but deep down, a simmering uncertainty persisted. Time trickled on, leading to a strange confrontation. I discovered a note slipped under my door one evening. "I know you've been watching. We should talk." My instincts screamed at the thought that he had orchestrated this interaction, locking me into something sinister. That very night, the air hung thick with anticipation, and I found myself standing on the threshold of his door, heart racing as I knocked softly against the frame. It didn't take long before he appeared, his gaze drawing me in with a blend of intrigue and menace. The dread coursed through my veins as I sensed something was very wrong. He gestured for me to join him in the quiet of his backyard, revealing freshly turned earth under that haunting glow of dusk. Even in the dark, I could see something shifting in the shadows, something ominous buried just beneath the surface. As I stepped closer, he drew me down to the earth, rooted in curiosity but fighting against the gnawing fear. He leaned close, murmuring tailing whispers. "Take a look," he urged. "You wanted to know what intrigues you so much." I felt the world freeze around us. My heart raced as horror unfurled. He revealed something that lay there, cold and rigid. A human limb emerged from the ground. My worst fears realized in a single agonizing moment. Gritting my teeth in sheer terror, I tried to leap free, but he held firm, forcing me to glimpse the monstrosity. "Curious people end up like this," he hissed, his smile reflecting twisted delight in my panic. With every ounce of strength, I broke free, my feet flying towards the sanctuary of home, echoes of his laughter drumming in my ears. Inside my house, the panic hadn't evaporated. I locked the door behind me, though the threat lingered. He now existed in my world, a harbinger of unending terror that would loom beyond the quiet confines of Willow Creek. I had lived in that closed neighborhood for more than 5 years, and until a few weeks ago, I thought I knew all the neighbors. I liked that feeling of familiarity, that routine that the place had. It was the type of neighborhood in which the houses were all more or less the same. Modest gardens, a couple of old trees on each street, and people who greeted you although they barely knew you. I had never had a real problem with anyone in the neighborhood, and although everyone was busy with their lives, they felt a certain security knowing that there were no intruders. At least that's what I thought. Everything changed the day I saw a moving van parked in front of the house that was unoccupied. For almost a year, I remember well it was Saturday, and I was having my first coffee in the morning when I saw the truck arrive. A man with dark hair and somewhat disheveled clothing got out of the driver's seat and opened the back. His appearance seemed normal to me at first glance. A tall guy with an old jacket and jeans, nothing out of the ordinary. I watched through the window while he and the movers unloaded his things and took them inside the house. At first, he didn't catch my attention. I thought he would be one of those discreet neighbors who never cause problems, and for me that was fine. But the days passed, and I began to notice things that didn't quite fit. Small details that made me wonder who my new neighbor really was. The first thing that bothered me was that although several days had passed since he moved in, I hadn't seen him interact with anyone else. In a neighborhood like ours, as soon as someone arrives, it's common for older neighbors to come over and introduce themselves, even if it's just to shake hands and ask where you come from or what brought you to move in. Yet no one seemed to have dared, and he didn't seek to interact either. In fact, as soon as he left his house during the day, a couple of times I tried to approach him and say hello, but the guy seemed evasive every time I saw him in the garden. Generally at dusk, he avoided eye contact and disappeared quickly toward the interior. At first, I thought maybe he was a reserved person or just liked to keep his distance, so I stopped thinking about it. But then the noises started. It was common to hear sounds in the adjacent houses, someone playing music or children playing, but from the new neighbor, the sounds were different. I heard knocks and scratches, sometimes very late at night. At first, I thought maybe he was remodeling, but those noises didn't feel like the typical hammering of a repair. They felt more intense, as if he was dragging something heavy and then hitting it repeatedly. Weeks passed, and every night the noises became more frequent. The knocks seemed to come from his backyard, the one I could barely see from the corner of my window. One night, intrigued, I went out to the patio with the lights off and stayed in the dark, trying to understand what my neighbor was doing at that time. Between the knocks and the unintelligible whispers, I managed to make out something. A shovel. The characteristic sounds of a shovel digging into wet ground could be heard, and after a while, the sharp thud of something falling into a hole. I went back home with a feeling of discomfort in my chest. I told myself that I shouldn't think badly, that maybe he was working on some gardening project, maybe planting something. But at that time, something inside me didn't quite feel calm. A couple of weeks passed, and the situation only got worse. The night noises continued to become more and more intense and at stranger times. One morning, I was woken up by sharp, dull knocks. Although I tried to ignore them, my mind began to fill the gaps with ideas I couldn't get rid of. At that point, every sound at night made me get up and look out the window toward my neighbor's house. Then one afternoon, I was returning from the supermarket when I saw the neighbor in his front garden. It was the first time I could see him up close in broad daylight. He was leaning over a bush, cutting branches with some rusty tools. It was only an instant, but when our eyes met, a shiver ran through me that I could not shake. His eyes were deep dark, and he looked at me without blinking. It was not a kind or inquisitive look, but rather one that contained a kind of warning, as if he had noticed my curiosity, and as if he knew that I had been watching him. From that day on, I began to notice other things that had previously gone unnoticed to me, especially the smell. Every time I passed near his house, a strange acidic and dense aroma floated in the air. It was a persistent smell like chemicals and wet earth, something that seemed to permeate the environment. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was some fertilizer he was using, but the aroma became more and more penetrating and difficult to ignore. One night, I decided against all instinct that I should know what was happening in that garden. I took advantage of a moment of silence to open my window and look closer. By the dim light of a lamp in his backyard, I saw that there were several mounds of earth scattered about, as if he had been digging in different places. But what caught my attention the most was a lump wrapped in black plastic half buried in the earth. It didn't move. It didn't make any sound. But something about that image was so disturbing to me that I felt nauseous. I closed the window and backed away. With my pulse racing, a few days passed in which I could barely sleep, each night thinking about what I had seen, questioning the noises and the smell in his garden. It was as if I had been trapped in a kind of cycle where everything revolved around that house and its owner. I began to avoid my friends and family. I knew that if I told them what I saw, they would laugh or tell me I was exaggerating. So, one afternoon, when I returned from work, I found a note on my door. The handwriting was neat and anonymous. "I know you've been watching. We should talk." That note left me paralyzed. I knew it was him, the neighbor, who wanted to talk. Every possibility that crossed my mind was worse than the last, but I felt that backing down was no longer an option. I was already too involved. That same night, with my hands trembling and trying to appear calmer than I really was, I headed toward his house. Everything was dark except for a light in the back garden. I walked through the entrance hallway, and in that overwhelming silence, I could hear just a murmur coming from inside. The door was ajar. The only thing that moved me was the need to understand what was really happening in that house. I knocked on the door frame and said his name in a low voice without an answer. I moved forward, feeling invaded by paranoia. I reached the kitchen and saw that the back door was open. With a faint glow coming from the garden, I looked out, and indeed, there he was, leaning over another one of those mounds of earth with a shovel in his hand. I stayed in the shadows, watching him make the last blows on the ground, crushing the mound, breathing hard and at the same time. Looking up, I knew that he had noticed my presence. "I was waiting for you," he said without completely turning around, with a calmness that chilled my bones. "I only came to see if you needed anything." I noticed. "It's good. There are strange things, noises, you murmur." It was then when I noticed a grimace on his face, a kind of barely perceptible smile that made me take a step back. "So, you've been watching me?" "No," he asked quietly, approaching with slow and calculated steps. I felt the ground fail beneath me. Every fiber of my being urged me to run away, but my legs didn't respond. With each step toward me, the situation became more oppressive, the air thicker. My mind was racing 1,000 miles an hour as I searched for a way out. An excuse, but I just stayed there, frozen. Suddenly, he extended his hand and held my arm tightly, almost with excessive force, taking me toward the center of the garden right next to a new hole that he had finished. "I want you to see what intrigues you so much," he whispered with a calmness that contrasted with the brutality with which he had grabbed me. I tried to resist, but my body did not react. It was as if the hand that held me was an anchor that was impossible to break. He forced me to kneel next to the hole and began to remove dirt with my hands, pulling aside small lumps that I could barely make out. In the darkness, then one of the hoaxes was completely exposed under the light, and I saw what I had feared from the beginning. A rigid, grayish human limb emerged from the ground. Horror invaded me, and finally my legs reacted. I tried to stand up, but he held me tighter, forcing me to look at his work. "This is what he does with curious people," he murmured, leaning toward me with a voice that sounded like a knife scraping metal. At that moment, I gathered all the strength that I had left and managed to free myself from his grip. I ran toward my house without looking back, with the sound of his footsteps following me, echoing in the silence of the night. I crossed my door and locked it, but I could still feel his presence, that latent threat that remained suspended in the air, as if he knew that deep down he was now in control. My name is Luke, and I was 26 years old when, on that night, I found myself alone, traversing the endless asphalt that connected San Antonio to the north. The journey had begun seamlessly. The sky was clear, loud music echoed throughout the vehicle, and the sensation of freedom you get from long distance driving with the windows down enveloped me. Everything flowed well until around 11 p.m. when my old sedan began to falter. At first, there was a rhythmic knocking that I thought I could dismiss. Then the sound escalated into a metallic screech that made my stomach churn. The car coughed like a feeble asthmatic, and as the engine died, I felt my heart race, panic surging through my veins. I maneuvered out of the car, adrenaline rushing through me, the once serene night transforming suddenly oppressive as if the air had thickened. I switched off the headlights and stared into the void of the dark road, brewing a sense of hopeless isolation. "Damn it," I muttered, pulling out my phone, but as expected, there was no signal. Highway 57 was notorious for being a technological desert in its more remote stretches. I stepped outside the car, scanning the horizon for any signs of other vehicles. The road was deserted, dimly lit by sparse light poles, as shadows from low bushes stretched grotesquely under the pale moonlight. With few options at my disposal, I stood near my car, awaiting a vehicle to pass by. Minutes morphed into what felt like hours of unbearable silence, occasionally interrupted by the gentle rustle of wind or the distant chirp of crickets. Just as despair began to creep in, I spotted headlights brightening in the distance. I straightened up, waving my arms almost desperately at the approaching vehicle. To my surprise, the lights belonged to an unusual sight. A slow-moving, dilapidated tractor, its wheels rolling steadily upon the asphalt. The oddity of a tractor appearing in the middle of nowhere at such an hour was surreal, yet I didn't ponder it. Any help was better than none. The tractor came to a halt a few meters away. A man climbed down, his broad-brimmed hat veiling half his face, and denim overalls stained with earth. He grasped an old flashlight, and as he approached with the beam illuminating his features, I noticed wrinkles and sun-baked skin, a face marked by years lived under the sun. His eyes glimmered strangely under the moonlight. "Troubles with your car, son?" he asked gruffly, yet there was a sense of benevolence in his tone. I nodded, struggling to maintain a facade of calm. "Yeah, the engine died suddenly. Might have overheated." The farmer eyed me calmly, but there was something unsettling in his gaze. It felt as if his dark eyes held memories too old to share. "I can take a look if you'd like. Got some tools on the tractor." "Of course, I really appreciate it," I responded, though my voice felt shaky. The man returned to his vehicle, retrieving an old toolbox, his movements deliberate and slow, as if dragging time along with him. I watched as he opened the hood and leaned in, examining the engine compartment. His rough, stained hands worked through the car's innards, but my attention was snagged by a shape just a few meters from the tractor. A figure covered with an old tarp. I might have overlooked it, but the moonlight illuminated its twisted outline, long and strange, like a person's form. My heart quickened. "Do you need help with that?" I pushed, trying to steer the conversation away from my rising fears. The farmer caught my gaze, and for one fleeting moment, his eyes lit up with a jarring intensity that sent chills down my spine. Then he returned to his task, casting a sideways glance as he muttered, "That doesn't concern you." I froze, a rising dread clenching at my throat. There was something about him that felt unsettling. Beyond the helpfulness he had shown, my mind raced with chilling thoughts of missing persons, of hunters who vanished in the Sierra. "Hey, thanks for your help," I said, taking a cautious step back toward my car. "I genuinely appreciate it." The farmer looked me over closely, and for an instant, an unsettling expression darkened his face, lurking like a predator. "Better get on your way, young man," he replied, his voice low. "And don't look back. It's not always safe around these parts." I nodded, swallowing hard, and stepped back into my sedan. Turning the key, I hoped for the best. The engine coughed a few times before finally roaring back to life. The farmer watched me from the shadows, holding the flashlight ominously. I pressed down on the accelerator, relieved to be departing from that peculiar presence, but I couldn't restrain myself from glancing back in the rearview mirror. He stood next to the tractor, but there was something else. The shape beneath the tarp was shifting as though something within was attempting to break free. My pulse quickened, and I accelerated, leaving everything behind as fast as I could. The road stretched endlessly like a snake, and each shadow seemed to grow longer. I sought to convince myself I had simply encountered an eccentric old man, but the unease wouldn't dissipate. After what felt like hours, lights from a gas station finally cut through the darkness, appearing like a beacon of safety. I pulled over, my legs trembling and a cold sweat staining my shirt. Stepping out of the car, I approached the young man behind the counter, whose sleepy expression sparked curiosity at my arrival. "Are you all right, friend?" he asked, eyebrows raised in concern. "Yes," I replied, though every part of my body was still shaking. "I just had an odd encounter further back on the highway." He elevated an eyebrow, shaking his head slightly. "That old farmer?" he said, teasingly, as though he were sharing a local legend. "Everyone around here knows of him. They say he wants more than just simple crops. People claimed he collects souls." I gasped, the weight of his words resounding in my mind along with the echo of the farmer's warning. "Don't look back." I had never felt superstitious before, but that night, with palpable fear coursing through me, I made a vow to never again travel along Highway 57 alone, especially not if my car broke down once again in the middle of nowhere. If you are enjoying the stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We had decided to camp in the Sierra de Arteaga, marking a year-end adventure, which promised to be the perfect escape from the city noise. It was a week filled with anticipation, breathing fresh air, basking in nature, and embracing the challenge of roughing it without modern comforts. We were 5 friends. Ivan, the most gung-ho adventurer, couldn't stop detailing the route we had planned. Monica, his girlfriend, who loved the outdoors yet wore a subtle hint of skepticism in her eyes. Raul, a climbing enthusiast who always brought more gear than necessary. Sandra, my younger sister, who joined more for the thrill of adventure than personal enjoyment. And me, Ernesto, the only one proficient in starting a campfire without the help of survival videos. The afternoon started graciously. We set up camp beside a stream that softly flowed between mossy rocks, and the mountains rose around us like sleeping giants. The sky transformed into an intense orange, foreshadowing a clear night. But as soon as the sun sank behind the peaks, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The chill came quickly, enveloping us as laughter faded into silence, along with the brilliance of daylight. Ivan and Raul set about kindling the bonfire while Monica and Sandra busied themselves with our canned dinner rations. I gazed at the huge, ancient trees, their branches forming unsettling silhouettes under the meager starlight. A sense of distrust washed over me. An oppressive silence hung in the air, making me feel unnerved, as though someone was watching us. "Stop being paranoid," Raul joked, noticing my silence. I shook my head, forcing a smile. I didn't wish to dampen their spirits, but deep down, I knew something was amiss. The stillness was abruptly shattered by the first shriek, a deafening roar that made us drop everything we were holding. Instinctively, we huddled closer to the bonfire, fearing it crafted a magical shield against whatever was lurking in the shadows. Raoul grabbed his powerful flashlight and illuminated the tranquil forest surrounding us. "What was that?" Sandra whispered, her voice barely audible. Then we saw it. A massive bear, larger than I had ever envisioned, emerging from the trees like a titan, snapping branches and crushing the ground under its immense weight. Its eyes glinted with an eerie and terrible intelligence, and it emitted another fearsome growl. Monica shrieked, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. "Don't move," Ivan urged through gritted teeth, though his voice revealed the quaking fear behind it. Their urging was futile as the bear dashed toward us, sending us into a frenzy. We scattered in all directions, stumbling over roots and collapsing onto the frigid soil. Sandra seized my hand, almost pulling Mia along with us as we strived to evade the monstrous figure. I heard Ivan curse, his voice lost within the chaos, followed closely by Raoul yelling for Monica as the bear collided with one of the tents, tearing it apart as if it were nothing but paper. The sound of heavy breaths and creaking branches pursued us, and I was on the verge of believing the nightmarish experience would never end. Then, without warning, a deep silence blanketed the surroundings. The bear had ceased its growling, and the cacophony of nearby trees and rustling ceased as well. I looked at Sandra, who trembled so viciously, I feared she might faint. We remained hunched down, finally willing to trust that we had escaped the monster temporarily. But we awaited news of our friends. As if an eternity had passed, Raoul finally re-emerged from the shadows, panting with a bleeding wound on his forehead. "We need to go." Panic radiated from his wide eyes. "That bear, it's not alone." I stood frozen, struggling to comprehend. "What do you mean?" But he was already urging us to rise and rush back toward camp. When we finally returned to the campsite, chaos erupted. The tents lay torn, backpacks scattered, and the bonfire nearly extinguished, sending smoke up into sorrowful spirals. Monica clung to Ivan, whose arm had been injured. "What happened?" I asked, my heart racing. Ivan was cursing. "It's not just the bear. It's something else," he gasped, his eyes wide with terror. Though I remained silent, grappling to absorb his words, I was strained. Person, out in the Sierra de Artiega in the darkness, somehow controlling the bear? The concept was absurd. Yet, as I studied Raoul's face, I saw that he was enraptured by the same notion. It was as if he was giving orders. I swear the bear looked at him like it expected something. Raoul confirmed, shuddering at the recollection. The idea was like an ice-cold clutch on my spine. We regrouped near the embers of the campfire, deliberating on our next steps, but the night was relentless. The air was thick with an unknown tension, suffocating us with whispers, a lingering sensation in my mind. I was convinced I could hear laughter, a dark, mocking sound. "We need to leave this place," Monica insisted, breaking the suffocating silence. Nods of affirmation followed instantly, but just as we began to gather whatever remained, the trees shivered once more, and the monstrous bear returned, creeping closer than before, its eyes glowing like red-hot embers. We stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. Then we spotted it. A human figure lingered behind the animal, dimly visible in the shadows. The figure wore a long, dark coat, his face shrouded in a hood, but the most terrifying sight was how the bear turned toward him, expectantly. "What the hell?" Raoul hissed, stepping back, but the figure raised an arm, pointing toward us, and the bear lunged forward, snarling like an unstoppable force of nature. There was no means of escape. We scattered, each of us aware that we couldn't outrun what was drawing near as the figure whistled. A sharp, piercing sound that halted the bear in its tracks. Silence returned, cloaking the scene, allowing the bear to turn around and lumber back into the woods as though the nightmarish creature was nothing more than a puppet on strings. The figure continued to regard us, and I felt the chill of its calculating stare before it melted into the darkness along with the bear. Left there, we stood, speechless, unsure of how long we remained that way until Ivan finally broke the silence. His voice hardly more than a whisper. "What was that?" Responses eluded us. We all knew that whatever we encountered was not human, or if it ever had been, it was now something far removed from humanity. The hours following were a maze of fear and exhaustion, our every step a battle to find a path back to civilization. We trudged on until our legs could barely support us, and when we sighted distant lights from a small town just after dawn broke, tears of relief streamed down our faces. The truck's engine growled under the dense layer of fog that had descended on Highway 57. The clock on the dashboard read almost 2 in the morning, although time felt like it had stopped, as if we were trapped in a limbo of asphalt and fog. There were 5 of us in the car. Samuel at the wheel, a guy with strong hands and attentive eyes. Lauren, with her lips pursed as she stared unblinkingly out the window. Chris, who couldn't stop nervously fiddling with the lighter he had brought for the cigarettes he never dared to light. Sophie, sitting next to him with her knees hugged to her chest, her face illuminated by the glow of her cell phone screen. And me, Emily, who felt an increasing sense of oppression in my chest. Our detour to Texas had seemed like an exciting idea at the time, a chance to explore the unknown during a night adventure. However, the thick fog resembled dirty cotton, clinging to the windshield and casting an ethereal glow from the headlights. "Are you sure we shouldn't stop?" Lauren asked, her voice quivering slightly after half an hour of driving. None of us blamed her. The road, once an endless stretch of dust and dry vegetation during the day, had transformed into a claustrophobic trap where escape felt impossible. Samuel bit his lip, a grimace spreading across his face, a telltale sign of the tension transforming from caution to outright fear. "It's not safe to park on the edge," he countered, keeping his eyes locked on the yellow line, which was barely visible in the midst of the fog. Someone could come, and, well, you know, each of us recognized the dark reputation of Highway 57, notorious for its long stretches of isolation and the terrible accidents that sometimes occurred along the way. Chris leaned forward, flicking the lighter again and again, its little flame casting erratic shadows across his face. "It's as if the fog is following us," he murmured. Lauren shot him an annoyed glance. "Can you not say creepy things, please? This place is scary enough without you planting bad ideas in my head." But what took place next banished any trace of sarcasm from our conversation. Just a few meters in front of us, something appeared in the fog, abruptly revealing itself as Samuel slammed on the brakes. The truck jolted, tires screeching against the wet pavement, forcing us all to lurch forward, fear tightening in our throats. "What was that?" Sophie exclaimed, her voice more a whisper than a scream. The headlights shone on 2 figures standing by the roadside, a man and a woman, their silhouettes draped in garments reminiscent of an earlier era. The man wore a dark suit topped with a wide-brimmed hat, nearly obscuring his face, while the woman next to him was clad in a flowing white dress and a shawl that danced with the frigid breeze. They appeared to be signaling for assistance, the man raising an arm in a clumsy and unnatural gesture. "God!" Chris gasped, dropping the lighter. "We need to stop." "Are you kidding me?" Lauren replied, her eyes wide with panic. "We don't even know if they're real." Samuel's face was a mix of terror and caution as he sat there, hands tense on the steering wheel. The couple stood still, their presence seemingly unnatural, feeling more like a mirage from a nightmare than real people in desperate need of aid. Paulina's voice broke the tense silence. "Let's not press forward. This isn't right." Instead of responding, Samuel began to slow down, hesitantly rolling down the window, the cold night air pouring in, and with it, a rancid scent that made me want to gag. He leaned out slightly, trying to communicate with them. "Do you need help?" The man merely lowered his arm and turned his head slowly toward us. My heart raced as dread washed over me. There were no lights in their eyes. It felt as if we were staring at hollow shells. In an instant, they vanished into the mist as if they belonged to another realm. "Did you see that?" Samuel shouted, his voice electrified with astonishment. We erupted in a chaotic chorus of overlapping questions, trying to explain the inexplicable. Chris stopped fumbling with his lighter and pressed into the seat, wanting to blend in with the fabric. "Those things don't happen in real life," exclaimed Lauren, now visibly shaken. "They did," Sophie snapped back, still fixated on the window, hoping perhaps the fog might reveal more secrets. Silence enveloped us again, only broken by the hum of the engine and the wind battering against the windows. The road stretched ahead, feeling darker, tighter, and fear settled into our stomachs like an anchor. After what felt like an eternity, we spotted lights in the distance. A gas station lit against the oppressive night. Samuel swerved the truck sharply and parked alongside a fuel pump. "I need a break," he said, scrambling out of the car, visibly shaken. We followed him in silence. The attendant, an elderly gentleman with a beard and weary eyes, eyed us curiously from behind the counter. When Samuel asked him for coffee, the man served it with unhurried hands. It was Paulina who finally spoke of our encounter. "It's common to see odd things around here," she said, attempting casualness in her voice. The clerk scrutinized us, his dark eyes gleaming with untold stories. He stroked his beard thoughtfully. "It depends on your definition of odd," he answered slowly. "But if you're speaking of the couple in the fog, you're not the first to witness them." Sophie dropped her water bottle and the clerk sighed. "That road has witnessed too much death, too many accidents. People say there are things that never rest. Stories of a couple who perished here many, many years ago. They say they were returning from their wedding when a truck ran them off-road in the fog. They died instantly. Ever since, people have seen them waiting for help, as if trying to warn drivers of danger, or perhaps merely seeking those who can grant them the peace they never found." My heart raced, an electric sensation coursing through me. Samuel stared at the ground, hands clenched firmly around the coffee cup. "But why do they disappear?" he questioned. The man shrugged nonchalantly, as if it were a query better left unanswered. We left the gas station in silence, each of us trapped in tangled thoughts. The thick fog still lingered, but now there was something different about it. The road, an endless stretch of asphalt, felt sinister now, as though its secrets were poised to unveil themselves. Samuel started the truck, and we continued down the highway, all of us knowing we had witnessed something that would never fade from our memories. And even though we never spotted the couple again, the lingering fear remained, hiding within every curve and shadow, as if a shadowy presence had chosen to accompany us forever. My name is Mark, and I am a firefighter in New York City. I have been working in this job for more than 20 years, and although I could say that I have become accustomed to emergencies, sirens, and tragedies, there are things that never go away from your mind. I have been in all kinds of situations, Impossible rescues, horrible accidents, and, of course, fires that seemed unstoppable. But there is one in particular, one that happened recently in an old house. It was the end of September, a cold and silent night. The city had spent a fairly quiet day at the station. My colleagues and I were having dinner, and most of us were already getting ready to sleep for a while when suddenly the alarm sounded. Whenever we hear that alarm, our heart beats hard. Even after so many years, you know that something is wrong, but you don't know what awaits you until we get into the truck. While we were leaving, they informed us by radio that it was a fire in an old house on the edge of the Bronx. They described it as an abandoned house, one of those that are on the outskirts and hardly anyone notices. I thought it would be one of those nights where the fire is due to homeless people sneaking in to light bonfires or something similar. But when we arrived at the scene, I knew I was wrong. The fire was much bigger than expected. As we were waiting from the road, we could already see the flames devouring the structure. The night sky was tinted orange, and the cold air mixed with the suffocating heat that the flames gave off. The house, located on a hill surrounded by bushes, seemed to be completely engulfed in fire. The scene was terrifying, but what worried me most was the absence of people around. Normally, when there is a fire, even in an abandoned house, there are always curious neighbors, someone watching from a distance. But that night, we were completely alone. We got off the truck and began to work quickly. My colleagues and I deployed the hoses, secured the perimeter, and prepared to attack the flames. My boss, Captain Thompson, gave the order to enter the house, even though the fire had already consumed much of the structure. There is always the possibility that there is someone trapped inside, no matter how unlikely it may be. We can never stop looking. The main door of the house was almost destroyed, hanging from a single hinge, and the roof had begun to collapse in some places. At first glance, it seemed that the house had been abandoned for a long time. The windows were broken, and the facade was covered in graffiti and vegetation that had begun to climb the walls. But something did not add up. The flames, although intense, did not seem to originate from something common, such as an accident or a bonfire. They seemed directed, as if they had started in several points of the house at the same time. I entered the house with 2 companions. The smoke was dense and suffocating. The flames roared as if they were alive, devouring everything in their path. We advanced through the main hallway that twisted under the heat. The walls, although covered in paint, seemed recent in some parts, as if someone had been there not long ago. My instinct told me that there was something else in that house, something that had nothing to do with just the fire. "Do you think there is someone here?" asked my partner Angela, raising her voice so that I could hear her over the roar of the flames. "I don't know," I answered, "but something is strange. Stay alert." We continued moving forward, checking the rooms as we went, but we didn't find anyone. The house, which looked small from the outside, was a labyrinth of empty rooms and stairs that creaked under our feet. The heat increased with every second, and the structure began to become unstable. The captain asked us to turn back, but just when we were going to leave, I heard something. It was a scream. I stopped in my tracks. I was sure I had heard someone's voice, a heartbreaking cry that came from the upper floor. I looked at Angela and James, the other companion who came with us. They didn't seem to have heard anything. "Did you hear that?" I asked, but they both looked at me with a mixture of bewilderment and haste. "I didn't hear anything, Mark," James said, pointing toward the ceiling where the beams were already beginning to give way. But I couldn't ignore it. That scream continued to echo in my head. It was impossible for me to have imagined it. Against my better judgment, I asked them to come forward while I ran towards the stairs that led to the second floor. "Wait, Mark!" shouted Angela, but I was already going up the stairs. They creaked under my feet, and the smoke became increasingly dense. Halfway up, the air became almost unbreathable, and I had to put on my mask. I reached the second floor, and the fire seemed to have destroyed much of the walls. However, the scream was heard again, louder this time. It came from the end of the hallway, where a half-open door revealed an orange glow behind it. I quickly approached, my heart beating a mile a minute. I pushed the door and entered what seemed like a main room. The flames consumed everything, but in the midst of the chaos, I saw something that left me frozen. A figure, a silhouette of a person standing next to the window. It was impossible to distinguish details because of the smoke, but it was there, motionless, as if it were watching me. "Hey, you have to get out of here!" I screamed with all my might, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there looking at me. I approached, but before I could take another step, the ceiling creaked violently, and a beam fell right in front of me, blocking the way. The heat was unbearable, and the room was beginning to collapse. I screamed helplessly, but at that moment, the figure simply vanished as if it had never been there. My legs were shaking, and sweat was running down my face. Under the helmet, there was no time to think. I had to get out of there. I hurried back down the stairs as fast as I could while the fire devoured the house around me. My companions were already outside when I arrived, and Angela looked at me with a mixture of relief and anger. "You're crazy. You could have killed yourself in there," she yelled at me, but I barely heard her. My mind was still on that figure that I had finally seen. The house completely collapsed before our eyes. The flames continued to roar while we tried to contain them from the outside. But what troubled me was not the fire, but what I had seen inside. Who was that person? How could he disappear so quickly? Later, while we were gathering our things, Captain Thompson came up to me and asked me if everything was okay. I hesitated for a second before answering. "Captain, I saw someone in there." I paused, searching for the words. It wasn't normal. Thompson looked at me in silence, as if he understood more than he was willing to admit. After a few seconds, he put a hand on my shoulder and said, "That house has been abandoned for more than 20 years, Mark. No one has set foot in there since a fire destroyed it the first time. They say that an entire family died in the fire, but they never found all the bodies." I was frozen. I didn't know what to answer. All I knew was that what I saw in that house was not my imagination. There was something or someone still trapped in that place. Since that night, I have had nightmares about the house. Every time I dream, I see that figure in the window, motionless, watching me, and I know deep down that the fire was not the only thing that consumed that house. If you are enjoying the stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. My name is Kyle, and I have been working as a bricklayer for more than 15 years in various areas of Chicago. I have seen everything from the construction of large buildings to the remodeling of old houses that are barely standing. The city changes quickly, but there are things that remain, like those old abandoned houses that hide among new constructions. Many of those houses have stories. Some are just rumors from neighbors, but others are full of mystery. And in one of those houses, Ocurio, Algo K on me persigue. It all started a few years ago when Freddie, a lifelong friend, disappeared without a trace. Freddie and I were inseparable since childhood. We grew up in the same neighborhood. We played basketball in the same parks, and when we got older, we found work in the same construction crew. He had always been more adventurous than me, always looking for something that would excite him, something that would take him out of the monotony of daily life. Maybe that's why I wasn't surprised when he told me that he had found an interesting new project. "Hey, have you seen the old house on Maple Avenue?" He asked me one morning while we were taking a break at the construction site where we were working. The one with the large windows and the rusty gate? I responded, remembering a house that I knew well from passing through that neighborhood. That same one. They offered me a job to restore it, Freddie said with a smile that I hadn't seen before. It's been half demolished for a long time, but the owner wants to make it habitable again. He's gonna pay well, and I want to do it. I have to get my hands on that house. I was surprised by that. Although in that part of the city it had always been a place that people avoided, abandoned for more than 20 years, it was more of a skeleton of what was once a mansion than a home. No one knew who the owner was or what history it had, but it had earned its reputation among the neighbors. There was something about it that unsettled anyone who passed by. The garden was overgrown with weeds, the windows were broken or blocked by old wood, and the main entrance, a large iron gate, seemed to have been sealed decades ago. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" I asked him, a bit uncomfortable. I have heard strange things about that house. Freddie laughed, as he always did when something sounded too exaggerated. "Nonsense, Kyle. The house is old." "Yes, but that's all it is, an old house. We will earn good money with this, and then we can work on whatever we want. Why don't you come with me? The job is big, and it would be good for me to have someone I trust." Couldn't say no. Freddie and I had worked together since we could remember, and if there was one thing I knew, it was that he never left me hanging. I accepted the job, although something in me did not stop warning me that this house was not like the others. We started the project on a Monday morning. When we arrived, the house looked worse than I remembered. The vines covered almost the entire facade, and the walls seemed to have leaned inward as if the weight of the years would crush them. But what caught my attention the most was the silence. There was no noise from the street nor the typical hustle and bustle of Chicago. It was as if the outside world stopped upon crossing the entrance of that property. Freddie, enthusiastic as always, did not seem to notice anything strange. He broke the rusty lock sealing the gate and with a smile gestured for me to follow him inside. We crossed the garden, making our way through the weeds, and arrived at the main door. The house was dark inside. Despite the large windows, the dust and humidity permeated the air, and the floor creaked with every step we took. "This is going to be a hard job, but when we finish this house, it is going to be luxurious," said Freddie excitedly while we explored, cleaning the place, removing debris, and repairing the damaged parts of the structure. However, as we progressed with the work, things began to happen that had no explanation. One afternoon, while we were repairing the roof, I heard a loud noise on the ground floor as if something had fallen. I went down to check, thinking that one of our tools had rolled, but I didn't find anything. Everything was in its place. I went back up to the roof and told Freddie, but he just looked at me and laughed. "The ghosts are already scaring you, Kyle," he told me half-jokingly. "I don't know what it was, but I swear I heard something," I insisted, but I let it go. Maybe I was just paranoid. The days went by, and the noises became more frequent each time we were away from the house. Freddie continued to joke calmly, but I began to feel more and more uncomfortable. One afternoon, when we were already about to finish for the day, Freddie decided he wanted to explore the basement. I hadn't set foot in there since we started, and to be honest, I had no intention of doing so. The basement was dark, damp, and it smelled like something I couldn't identify. It wasn't just humidity. It was something else. Something unpleasant that made my stomach turn every time I passed near the door that led to it. "I'm going to go down and see what's down there. Maybe we can do something with that space," Freddie told me, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "I don't think that's a good idea," I responded, trying not to sound like a coward. "That place hasn't been touched in decades. It might be full of vermin or worse." Freddy smiled and patted me on the back. "Don't be a chicken, Kyle. I'm just going to take a look." Before I could protest further, Freddy went down the basement stairs, disappearing into the darkness. I stayed upstairs waiting for him to return, as he always did. I stood near the door, listening to Freddy's footsteps echoing in the basement while he was moving debris or exploring the place. 10 minutes passed, and I didn't hear anything else. The silence in the house became thicker, more disturbing. I began to call him. "Come on, is everything fine down there?" I shouted, but there was no response. I went down a couple of steps, looking out with the flashlight. The light barely illuminated the first meters of the basement, which seemed full of old furniture covered in dust. I kept calling, but the silence was total. My hands began to sweat, and the discomfort turned into fear. I decided to completely lower myself. Something inside me told me not to do it, but I couldn't leave Freddy down there. As I descended, the feeling of claustrophobia increased. The air became denser and colder. I reached the bottom of the stairs and moved the flashlight from one side to the other, looking for Freddy. The basement was bigger than I imagined. It was full of old furniture and rusty tools, but there was no sign of Freddy. I called him again, this time with more urgency. "Freddy, stop playing," I shouted, trying to sound firm, but my voice trembled. Silence. The guy had disappeared. I started searching throughout the basement, illuminating every corner, but there was no sign of him. Just when I was preparing to go up the stairs and look for help, I heard a sound behind one of the walls. It was a knock, a muffled echo, as if someone was on the other side of the wall. I approached slowly, feeling the surface. The wall seemed hollow in certain points, as if there were a space behind it. I knocked with my knuckles, and the sound confirmed that there was something beyond. My heart raced. I looked for a crowbar among the tools and began desperately scraping the plaster against the wall, revealing some sort of hidden wooden door. It was locked with an old rusty chain. I broke the chain with the crowbar and opened the door. Behind it, there was a narrow hallway that was dark and even colder than the rest of the basement. The humidity was louder, and the floor was covered in dirt and debris. I advanced down the hallway with the flashlight held high, shaking, hoping to find Freddy at any moment. But what I found was something much worse. The hallway led to a small underground room. There, in the center, was a kind of improvised altar with unlit candles and old photographs scattered on the floor. On the walls, there were strange marks like drawings or symbols that I didn't understand. And then I saw it. It wasn't Freddy. It was a dry, almost mummified body lying in a corner. I could tell how long he had been there, but something told me that this was not the first time that someone had disappeared in that house. I ran away. I never saw Freddy again. My name is Mark, and I am a firefighter in New York City. I have been working in this job for more than 20 years, and although I could say that I have become accustomed to emergencies, sirens, and tragedies, there are things that never go away from your mind. I have been in all kinds of situations, impossible rescues, horrible accidents, and, of course, fires that seemed unstoppable. But there is one in particular, one that happened recently in an old house. It was the end of September, a cold and silent night. The city had spent a fairly quiet day at the station. My colleagues and I were having dinner, and most of us were already getting ready to sleep for a while when suddenly the alarm sounded. Whenever we hear that alarm, our heart beats hard. Even after so many years, you know that something is wrong, but you don't know what awaits you until we get into the truck. While we were leaving, they informed us by radio that it was a fire in an old house on the edge of the Bronx. They described it as an abandoned house, one of those that are on the outskirts and hardly anyone notices. I thought it would be one of those nights where the fire is due to homeless people sneaking in to light bonfires or something similar. But when we arrived at the scene, I knew I was wrong. The fire was much bigger than expected. As we were waiting from the road, we could already see the flames devouring the structure. The night sky was tinted orange, and the cold air mixed with the suffocating heat that the flames gave off. The house, located on a hill surrounded by bushes, seemed to be completely engulfed in fire. The scene was terrifying, but what worried me most was the absence of people around. Normally, when there is a fire, even in an abandoned house, there are always curious neighbors, someone watching from a distance. But that night, we were completely alone. We got off the truck and began to work quickly. My colleagues and I deployed the hoses, secured the perimeter, and prepared to attack the flames. My boss, Captain Thompson, gave the order to enter the house, even though the fire had already consumed much of the structure. There is always the possibility that there is someone trapped inside, no matter how unlikely it may be. We can never stop looking. The main door of the house was almost destroyed, hanging from a single hinge, and the roof had begun to collapse in some places. At first glance, it seemed that the house had been abandoned for a long time. The windows were broken, and the facade was covered in graffiti and vegetation that had begun to climb the walls. But something did not add up. The flames, although intense, did not seem to originate from something common, such as an accident or a bonfire. They seemed directed, as if they had started in several points of the house at the same time. I entered the house with two companions. The smoke was dense and suffocating. The flames roared as if they were alive, devouring everything in their path. We advanced through the main hallway that twisted under the heat. The walls, although covered in paint, seemed recent in some parts, as if someone had been there not long ago. My instinct told me that there was something else in that house, something that had nothing to do with just the fire. "Do you think there is someone here?" asked my partner Angela, raising her voice so that I could hear her over the roar of the flames. "I don't know," I answered, "but something is strange. Stay alert." We continued moving forward, checking the rooms as we went, but we didn't find anyone. The house, which looked small from the outside, was a labyrinth of empty rooms and stairs that creaked under our feet. The heat increased with every second, and the structure began to become unstable. The captain asked us to turn back, but just when we were going to leave, I heard something. It was a scream. I stopped in my tracks. I was sure I had heard someone's voice, a heartbreaking cry that came from the upper floor. I looked at Angela and James, the other companion who came with us. They didn't seem to have heard anything. "Did you hear that?" I asked, but they both looked at me with a mixture of bewilderment and haste. "I didn't hear anything, Mark," James said, pointing toward the ceiling where the beams were already beginning to give way. But I couldn't ignore it. That scream continued to echo in my head. It was impossible for me to have imagined it. Against my better judgment, I asked them to come forward while I ran towards the stairs that led to the second floor. "Wait, Mark!" shouted Angela, but I was already going up the stairs. They creaked under my feet, and the smoke became increasingly dense. Halfway up, the air became almost unbreathable, and I had to put on my mask. I reached the second floor, and the fire seemed to have destroyed much of the walls. However, the scream was heard again, louder this time. It came from the end of the hallway, where a half-open door revealed an orange glow behind it. I quickly approached, my heart beating a mile a minute. I pushed the door and entered what seemed like a main room. The flames consumed everything, but in the midst of the chaos, I saw something that left me frozen. A figure, a silhouette of a person standing next to the window. It was impossible to distinguish details because of the smoke, but it was there, motionless, as if it were watching me. "Hey, you have to get out of here!" I screamed with all my might, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there looking at me. I approached, but before I could take another step, the ceiling creaked violently, and a beam fell right in front of me, blocking the way. The heat was unbearable, and the room was beginning to collapse. I screamed helplessly, but at that moment, the figure simply vanished as if it had never been there. My legs were shaking, and sweat was running down my face. Under the helmet, there was no time to think. I had to get out of there. I hurried back down the stairs as fast as I could while the fire devoured the house around me. My companions were already outside when I arrived, and Angela looked at me with a mixture of relief and anger. "You're crazy. You could have killed yourself in there," she yelled at me, but I barely heard her. My mind was still on that figure that I had finally seen. The house completely collapsed before our eyes. The flames continued to roar while we tried to contain them from the outside. But what troubled me was not the fire, but what I had seen inside. Who was that person? How could he disappear so quickly? Later, while we were gathering our things, Captain Thompson came up to me and asked me if everything was okay. I hesitated for a second before answering. "Captain, I saw someone in there." I paused, searching for the words. It wasn't normal. Thompson looked at me in silence, as if he understood more than he was willing to admit. After a few seconds, he put a hand on my shoulder and said, "That house has been abandoned for more than 20 years, Mark. No one has set foot in there since a fire destroyed it the first time. They say that an entire family died in the fire, but they never found all the bodies." I was frozen. I didn't know what to answer. All I knew was that what I saw in that house was not my imagination. There was something or someone still trapped in that place. Since that night, I have had nightmares about the house. Every time I dream, I see that figure in the window, motionless, watching me, and I know deep down that the fire was not the only thing that consumed that house. I have been working at Costco in my town for 10 years. Although it was challenging to initially adjust to the night shift, it eventually became my favorite routine. The stillness, the lack of customers, and the repetition of cleaning and organizing tasks provided me with a sense of peace that I had not experienced before. For some coworkers, working at night was unbearable, but for me, it was almost therapeutic. That evening began like any other. I arrived shortly before 9 and greeted Ryan, my coworker in the warehouse, and James, who was responsible for monitoring the security cameras. Both of them were new and still gaining experience on the night shift, but they made for pleasant company. Ryan joked about how he had heard that this Costco was haunted, sharing stories about aisles where products mysteriously fell or shadows that appeared to move between the shelves. I chuckled at his nervousness. In all my years of working, I had never encountered anything unusual. At 11 p.m., with the store closed, we started restocking merchandise. James was in the surveillance room reviewing the cameras while I made my way to the canned goods aisle. It was the longest and often the most monotonous. While arranging the cans, I realized that the environment felt colder than usual. I thought the air conditioning was running too aggressively, which was common for this time of year. A little while later, I heard a sharp sound, as if something heavy had hit the floor. I stood up and glanced toward the end of the aisle. A shopping cart rolled by as if someone had shoved it. The odd thing was that the cart hadn't been there when I arrived. I suspected Ryan was playing a prank, but when I called him on the radio, he didn't respond. Walking back to the cart, I pushed it aside. The aisle was deserted. I didn't dwell on it too long and returned to my work, but that night, the atmosphere felt different and charged. For the first time, I felt as if something was watching me as I continued restocking items. Another sound caught my attention, a louder noise. It sounded like several boxes had toppled over on a nearby shelf. I decided to investigate. I walked toward the cleaning aisle, where we stored the large packages of toilet paper and towels. There, several boxes lay scattered on the floor, but there was no evidence that anyone had relocated them. "Ryan, James, are you messing with me?" I shouted, but only an echo answered. I straightened things up and went back to the main area, but an unsettling feeling continued to nag at me. I headed to the surveillance room to talk to James. When I arrived, he was staring intently at the screens. "What's wrong?" I inquired. "I'm not sure. I saw something odd in the refrigerated aisle a little while ago," he replied, gesturing at the screen. I stepped closer and watched the video. A shadow swiftly darted between the refrigerators, but it was difficult to make out. "Ryan?" I asked almost absent-mindedly. James shook his head, leading me to decide to check the refrigerators, convinced that Ryan was just pulling a prank on us. But when we got there, the area was empty, cold and silent, as expected. I inspected every nook and cranny but found nothing. Just as I was about to head back, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around. Bang! But nobody was there, just the neatly arranged refrigerators glimmering under the lights. I returned to the surveillance room, determined to get to the bottom of the situation. However, James was nowhere to be found. His chair was vacant, and on the camera screens, I only saw deserted hallways. A knot twisted in my stomach. I tried reaching him on the radio, but neither James nor Ryan replied. "Where are they?" I demanded, pacing through the store with increasingly hurried steps. As I passed the appliance section, I noticed that one of the screens was illuminated, something that shouldn't have occurred. A blank image appeared on the screen, black, seemingly from the gardening aisle. Although the camera wasn't meant to capture anything at that moment, I moved closer to turn it off. But at that moment, a figure dashed across the corridor, projected on the screen. My blood ran cold. There was no one else in the store, and if there was, they shouldn't be there. I sprinted toward the gardening aisle, but when I arrived, I found only a cart full of mismatched tools. The sensation of being watched increased. I tried to call security on the radio, but I got no response. The radio emitted only static. The silence became oppressive, prompting me to find my coworkers before the situation grew further bizarre. I was at a loss to explain what was happening, but with every passing minute, I felt more entrapped in the enormous warehouse. As I traversed the dark corridors, the air grew heavier, and the lights that used to brightly illuminate every corner now flickered irregularly. I bypassed certain areas that were shrouded in darkness, which did not invite exploration. With each step, the sense of being observed intensified, as if something invisible were trailing behind me. While moving through the appliance section, I heard a low, muffled laugh that seemed to originate from the end of the hallway. I froze, attempting to pinpoint the exact source of the sound. The laugh was unnatural, fractured, as though the person producing it was forcing it out. "Ryan, James, this isn't amusing," I yelled, my voice shattering the absolute silence. There was no response, just the echo of my words. I cautiously approached the end of the hallway, holding my flashlight as if that was enough to protect me. When I turned the corner, I saw something that caused me to stop. A shopping cart stood before me, filled with product boxes. The peculiar detail was that the boxes were stacked perfectly, nearly with obsessive precision. Then, something shifted behind the cart. As soon as I could make out the silhouette of a tall figure, it slipped toward the refrigerator aisle. I dashed after it, my heart pounding fiercely in my chest. James, Ryan, this is getting ridiculous. I shouted as I turned toward the refrigerators, but there was nobody. Suddenly, the lights went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. Only my flashlight permitted me to see a few meters ahead. I heard rapid footsteps, but I couldn't ascertain their origin. They grew closer and then retreated, as if someone was running in circles around me. "Show yourself," I screamed, my voice cracking with fear. The flashlight trembled in my hand, and then the beam illuminated something that shouldn't have been there. A series of wet footprints on the floor extending from the refrigerators to my position. They were large, far too big to belong to Ryan or James. Before I could process what I was witnessing, a loud thump resonated behind me, and the echo filled the hallway. I turned quickly, only to find one of the refrigerator doors wide open. Inside, the cold air billowed out like a thick cloud. I walked closer to the door, compelled by something I could not define. But before I could peek inside, a cold hand landed on my shoulder. The chilling contact froze me. My body refused to respond, felt as if I were nailed to the ground. Slowly, I turned my head, hoping to see one of my coworkers, but I found no one. Only the frigid air surrounding me and the unmistakable sensation that something was breathing nearby. I took a step back, stumbling. Instantly, everything was shrouded in complete darkness, except for the faint flickering of the refrigerator lights. Then I heard a low whisper, unintelligible yet clearly aimed at me. My hands shook as I struggled to pick up the flashlight, but before I could turn it on, something heavy brushed past me, and the feeling of not being alone intensified. I turned toward the refrigerators, and then I saw a dark figure standing in front of one of the open refrigerators, staring at me. I couldn't discern its face, but its presence was suffocating, a shadow denser than the surrounding darkness. I attempted to retreat, but my back hit the shelves. The figure began to approach me slowly, its footsteps echoing like a sinister drum on the floor. I closed my eyes, hoping that this was just a dream, that when I opened them, the figure would vanish. But when I opened them, it was right in front of me. I can't recall much else about what happened next. I only know that I woke up hours later on the floor, with the cold from the refrigerator numbing my feet and a throbbing pain in my head. My coworkers were missing, the lights were back on, and Costco appeared deserted. When I looked for Ryan and James, I couldn't find either of them. According to the manager, they had left before me that night, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The security cameras were inexplicably malfunctioning, and the footage showed nothing unusual. I never returned to that store, but every time I pass by a Costco, I can't help but glance at the lights, hoping to see the shadow of that figure that haunted me forever that night. If you are enjoying the stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. My name is Jake, and I have been driving trucks for more than a decade. It's tough work, but I enjoy it. It provides me the comfort of routine, a set path to follow, and above all, the solitude of the open road. That night, I had to make a delivery from New York City to Philadelphia, a route I knew so well that I could drive it with my eyes closed. I commenced my journey around 10 p.m., with the sky clear and promising a smooth ride. Traffic was nearly non-existent, just the occasional car passing by, and the streetlights illuminated the lanes with a steady rhythm. I was accustomed to these solitary journeys, but something felt different that night. I didn't recognize it immediately, not exactly. Maybe it was the colder air or the slight flicker in the streetlights as if they were blinking irregularly. I passed the first landmark, a gas station, which I regularly found empty at that hour, but something caught my eye. A vehicle was parked next to the pumps, engine running, and inside I could see a silhouette. It was not unusual. Truckers or long-distance drivers sometimes took breaks. However, as I continued on, I glimpsed the reflection of the car's headlights in my rearview mirror, and something about the way that figure sat left me feeling uneasy. A few kilometers later, just before entering the loneliest stretch of road, a white compact car appeared behind me. I paid little attention to it at first, but when several minutes rolled by and it remained at the same distance, I started to notice a pattern. It neither attempted to overtake nor fade away. It seemed intent on staying right in my shadow. I turned on the radio to occupy my mind, but the static overpowered any signal. I switched to another channel, but the relentless buzzing wouldn't cease. It's just interference, I told myself, although I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The white car remained behind me, maintaining a distance that felt meticulous. I peered into the rearview mirror more than I should have, searching for any sign that it would pass or veer off, but it didn't. Its quiet and unwavering presence began to unsettle me. I accelerated slightly, hoping that my truck would outpace it, but while it wasn't fast enough to gain significant distance, the car adjusted its speed, staying a short distance from my rear bumper. I attempted to reassure myself that it was just another motorist on the road. There was nothing strange about it. However, moments later, I reached the tunnel in the overpass, and there was always something comforting about that part. The echo of engines, the brief stretch of covered road, and the closeness of Philadelphia. Yet, upon entering, I sensed that the air felt different, heavy. The white car was no longer following, or so I initially thought. When I looked back and didn't see it, my relief was short-lived. Exiting the tunnel, however, I spotted the car lights in my mirrors once more, but it wasn't behind me. This time, I saw it cruising slowly in the opposite lane going the wrong way. My heart raced. I recognized it, the shape, the headlights, the white exterior. I must be exhausted, I told myself, searching for logic. There was no possible way the car could be in front of me if I hadn't traveled through the tunnel simultaneously. But there it was. I passed by, clearly seeing the driver, an unmoving figure with hands resting on the wheel and a face obscured in shadows. As I continued forward, another odd occurrence began to unnerve me. The road signs appeared to repeat themselves. First, a sign indicating a detour for maintenance, then another displaying the distance to Philadelphia. After a few kilometers, I noticed the same signs again, as if I hadn't made any progress at all. The road is under construction, I mused. Maybe there's a detour I overlooked. When I checked my GPS, a knot twisted in my stomach. The screen displayed a static point, suggesting my truck wasn't moving. No way. The tires were in motion, and the engine revved, but it was as though I was ensnared in place. The white car reappeared behind me, perfectly in sync. My heart raced as it pounded in my chest. This was no longer just a monotonous drive. Something or someone was toying with me on this road. I fought to keep calm, convincing myself it was merely my imagination, nothing more. But that idea didn't stand much longer. As I proceeded, the signs grew increasingly peculiar. A warning about rock slides appeared not once but 3 times within 5 minutes. I was keenly aware of where I should be, yet everything pointed to the fact that this was not the case. The road remained deserted, and my phone signal had vanished. I moved my device from side to side in search of a single bar. Nothing. The radio was futile. I resolved to pull over. Perhaps a brief respite would clear my thoughts. I parked the truck on the shoulder, turning off the engine. The surrounding darkness was suffocating, almost tangible. I sat in the cabin, taking deep breaths. No cars were passing, not even the faint sound of the highway. I turned on a flashlight and opened the door, stepping out cautiously. The cold was sharper than I expected. I walked a few steps to check the tires in case anything could explain my unease. Everything appeared to be in order. I returned to my truck, freezing when I gazed into the rearview mirror. The white car was parked just meters away from me, engine silent but headlights glowing, flooding the back of my vehicle with light. I jumped into the driver's seat, quickly closing the door and starting the engine. My breathing grew quick. I glanced back, hoping to see the driver exit or some movement, but the car sat still, as if it were merely watching me. I resolved to leave, putting distance between myself and that vehicle. I pressed down on the accelerator harder than I should have, knowing the danger of speeding in a cargo truck, though I was beyond caring. All I wanted was to reach Philadelphia. However, the roadway stretched endlessly, devoid of recognizable landmarks, with only the white line zipping beneath the wheels and the poles flickering in the distance. After a while, I checked the side mirrors again. No sign of the white car, as if it had never existed. I felt a small sense of relief, but just as I began to convince myself it had merely been a figment of my imagination, a jarring thump echoed from the back of the truck. I slammed on the brakes. The screech of the tires pierced the stillness. My heart raced as I exited the truck, flashlight in hand, making my way toward the trailer. I knew something had hit my cargo, but upon arrival, I found nothing. Everything appeared intact and secured. However, when I turned to return to the cabin, I was startled to see fresh footprints in the earth adjacent to the tires of the truck. Bare footprints. My hands trembled as I aimed the light toward them. The footprints were undeniably distinct, and the most alarming detail was their trajectory. They headed away from the road toward the back of the truck but did not retrace their steps. I looked in all directions, desperately searching for any sign of who had left them. But there was nothing but shadows and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. Clambering back into the cab as quickly as I could, I secured the doors tightly and initiated the engine. Yet, something was amiss. The dashboard light flickered, the engine coughed, and reluctantly started, as if something were holding it back. Clenching the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turned white from the pressure. I understood I couldn't remain there, not after what I had seen. I proceeded cautiously, wary that any move might provoke another blow to the rear. But shortly after setting off, the highway lights started to malfunction. First one, then another, until I was navigating a dark stretch of road. I activated the high beams, though it made no difference. That was when I spotted the figure, a few meters in front of me, standing in the center of the road. The same figure I had seen earlier in the white car, frozen, a shadowy silhouette. I slammed on the brakes, fixating my gaze on it, anticipating it would move or react. But it remained still. "Who are you?" I screamed, more to reassure myself than to await a reply. The figure did not respond. I grabbed my flashlight and flung open the truck door, resolved to confront it. The air was frigid, even colder than it should have been. I walked toward the figure, my light flickering in my grasp. But when I was just a few steps away, it began to shift. Not toward me, but around itself. It moved from side to side, as if inspecting me, but its motions weren't natural. They were unnaturally rapid, almost fluid, as if it were gliding rather than walking. My chest tightened as I retreated toward the truck, but I stumbled and collapsed to the ground. The flashlight rolled away and went dark, leaving me enveloped in complete darkness, hearing only my own hurried breathing and the thunderous thump of my heartbeat. I sensed a weight behind me as if something were creeping closer. Struggling, I turned, and the last thing I caught a glimpse of before rising was a flash, two eyes glimmering in the dark. I crawled toward the cab, hoisting myself clumsily back inside and revving the engine for what felt like the first time without hesitation. This time, without glancing back, I pressed the accelerator as hard as I could. The truck lurched forward, albeit sluggishly, but sheer terror propelled me. I sensed it, something was in pursuit. Although I couldn't see it, I knew it stalked me. The lights on the dashboard flickered more urgently, and the roar of the engine merged with a strange sound, a low growl resonating through the air. I accelerated without a backward look. Each kilometer felt eternal, but at last, I beheld a toll booth's lights glimmering in the distance. It was like a beacon amidst the darkness, the promise that this nightmare would soon end. My heartbeat began to calm a bit, even as I felt that constriction in my chest, as though something invisible continued to track me. When I reached the toll booth, I slowed down and halted before the barrier. The attendant exited his cabin, a graying man clad in a reflective vest, a cigarette perched on his lips. He appeared unfazed, as though my condition didn't faze him at all. "Everything all right, young man?" he inquired as he approached. I struggled to find words, staring at him with wild eyes, unable to articulate my experience. I managed to barely verbalize a concern about someone tailing me. The man regarded me calmly, turning to glance at the road behind me. "There's no one here, fella," he noted, gesturing toward the empty road. I turned quickly, bracing for the sight of the white car or the figure lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just my truck and the deserted road behind me. For a moment I felt foolish. Perhaps I had been imagining things. Maybe the fatigue and monotony of the drive had played tricks on me. The attendant raised the barrier, allowing me to pass through. I distanced myself from the booth, feeling a sense of calm, though fear's remnants lingered in my chest. I continued on for a few more kilometers, and when a small illuminated stop appeared, I resolved to stop and catch my breath. I shut off the engine and stepped out of the cabin, allowing the crisp air to clear my mind. The sense of security was palpable, now that I was under the glow of a streetlight. I swung open the rear door of the truck to check the cargo one last time. Everything was just as it should be, nothing was out of place. I leaned against the side of the vehicle, exhaling deeply. I scanned the area around me. The bus stop was deserted, yet it felt welcoming. The streetlights flickered softly, and the sound of crickets disrupted the silence. I finally felt safe. I climbed back into the cabin, preparing to complete the job. As I ignited the engine and adjusted the mirrors, that's when I spotted movement inside the trailer in the rearview mirror. I quickly turned my head, but saw nothing. The space was unoccupied, just as I had left it. I checked the rearview mirror again, and a chill coursed through my veins. There was something in the cabin behind me, simply a shadow, a human outline, but enough to freeze me in my seat. I couldn't move. The figure remained motionless, but I felt its breath as if it were mere inches from my neck. Suddenly, the engine roared to life as if it had a will of its own. The rearview mirror shook, and the figure vanished as if it had never existed, but the fear lingered. I wasn't alone. I knew it. I work at a gas station situated along the highway in Pennsylvania. It is surrounded by open land and a couple of diners that are bustling during the day but become silent ruins at night. My shift starts at 10 p.m. and concludes at dawn. I have always enjoyed the peace of the night, although at times that stillness can feel unsettling. That evening, everything appeared normal initially. I had stocked the inventory of the refrigerators, organized the water bottles, and wiped down the counter. The number of customers was minimal, just one or two cars pulling in to refuel and carry on their journey. At midnight, the traffic on the highway began to diminish, creating a strange void that weighed heavily in the atmosphere. The first indication that something was amiss was the black van parked next to the farthest pump. There was something about how it just sat there with its lights off and the engine softly purring that set off alarm bells for me. I waited a few minutes, but no one emerged. I decided to approach cautiously to offer assistance, although an inner voice warned me not to. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound composed. There was no reply. The tinted glass reflected my face under the gas station lights. Suddenly, the passenger window lowered slightly, and a deep voice responded, "Just let it go." Something about his tone made me uneasy. He wasn't aggressive, but he was also not inviting. The engine continued to run, and even though I couldn't decipher what he wanted, I chose to head back to the counter. While attending to the register, I peered out the window, and for the next 15 minutes, the truck remained completely still. As the minutes passed, the black truck continued to sit there without any movement, just the steady hum of the engine. I tried to ignore it and stick to my routine, but an unsettling feeling gnawed at me. I checked the security cameras from the monitor in the office. From there, I could see that the driver hadn't gotten out and didn't seem to be doing anything at all. I decided not to take any further action and focused on the next vehicle, a gray sedan that rolled in around 1 a.m. The driver was an older gentleman with thick glasses and a wrinkled shirt. He filled up his tank and approached the counter to pay. "That truck's been there for a while. I don't like its vibe," he said. "It hasn't done anything odd." I lied, aiming to mask my own restlessness. "He's probably just resting." The man frowned but didn't offer anything else. He left, and I was left with my thoughts once again. I checked the clock. It was 1:15. Suddenly, I saw on the cameras that another car had arrived. A white compact parked near the same spot as the truck. 2 men exited the car, both wearing hooded sweatshirts. Although the warmth of the night didn't warrant that attire, I figured it was none of my concern. From my position behind the counter, I watched as the 2 men approached the truck. They lingered near the driver's side window, exchanging words that I couldn't make out. One of the cameras captured them from above, and I noted something that heightened my anxiety. They frequently glanced towards the store, as if verifying that I wasn't watching them. My heart raced as I saw one of them reach into his sweatshirt pocket and pull out something shiny. I couldn't make out what it was, but the gesture was quick and anxious, as though they were trying to avoid detection. At that moment, I regretted not having called the police earlier, even though I had no concrete evidence to report. I chose to pretend I hadn't seen anything and made my way toward the back of the store, out of sight. From that vantage point, I heard a sharp knock, a sound that rang as if the truck door had been forcefully closed. The silence that followed felt even worse. I cautiously approached the counter and noticed that the men were nowhere to be found. The compact car remained, but the truck had shut off its engine and lights, leaving it dark and still. Meanwhile, the compact car's headlights remained illuminated. I tried to redirect my thoughts and focus on something else, but the sense of danger grew stronger. I decided to check the cameras again for any sign of the men that had just left, but they were now invisible both inside the store and around the vehicles. I returned to the counter to dial the police, but the line was dead. I attempted my cell phone, but there was no signal, which was strange given that I usually had excellent reception in this area. The roadway was empty, and the thought of stepping outside to seek help seemed more dangerous than staying put. At 2 a.m., the store lights began to flicker. I assumed it was an electrical issue, nothing unusual for an aging gas station. I walked toward the switch to investigate, but as I was doing so, I heard a loud knock against the glass entrance door. I spun around abruptly and noticed a dark figure hastily retreating, leaving a blurred mark on the glass. "Hey, what do you want?" I shouted, attempting firmness despite my trembling voice. There was no response. I returned to the counter and, when I glanced outside, saw someone had left an object on the ground before the door. It was a black plastic bag tied shut, and something inside was moving slightly as though alive. My instincts urged me not to open it, but curiosity overwhelmed me. I decided to wait and refrain from touching it. I observed it from the counter, trying to make sense of what it could be. As I did so, the lights flickered again before plunging into total darkness, leaving only the dim glow from the outdoor lamps. My stomach knotted. The store was enveloped in darkness, making each shadow larger and more ominous. Then I heard footsteps, not from outside but from within the store. The sounds were light, as if someone was trying to be stealthy. I felt paralyzed, unsure of what to do. The cameras showed nothing, but the steps drew closer with each passing moment, the sound unmistakably getting nearer. My heart raced as I searched for something, anything, to defend myself. In a corner of the counter, I spotted a wrench used for adjusting the gas pumps. Gripping it with trembling hands, I readied myself for whatever lurked behind the shelves. The silence became thick and oppressive, as if the entire place held its breath. I moved cautiously toward the corridor where I thought I heard footsteps. The flashlight on the counter barely illuminated the area, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. As I rounded the corner, I noticed one of the refrigerator doors was ajar, emitting cold steam that filled the air. I advanced slowly, hoping to find someone hiding among the shelves. But when I reached the refrigerator, it was empty. I slammed the door shut, trying to regain composure just as a dull knock sounded at the back door of the store. The gas station had an exit leading to a small warehouse and then to the open lot behind. I approached the rear exit with the wrench raised, feeling each step resonate in my mind. When I reached the door, I saw it was slightly open. I pushed it wide, illuminating the dark corridor outside with my flashlight. Under the dim glow of a streetlight, I spotted a man in a hood holding something in his hands. "What do you want?" I yelled, feeling my voice quiver. The man offered no response. Instead, he took a step closer, dropping an object to the ground. It was another black bag, identical to the one left in front of the store. Something inside it was moving, sending chills down my spine as I stepped back to maintain my distance. Before I could react, yet another knock resounded at the main entrance. I dashed toward the counter, and through the cameras, I noted that the compact car had vanished, but the black van remained with its engine running. In front of the entrance stood two more figures that had joined the man with the bag, blocking any path of escape. I was cornered. I couldn't flee or call for help. I had only the wrench and an empty store that seemed to shrink around me. As I grappled with what to do, the lights flickered once more, and knocking erupted from all directions. The main entrance, the side windows, and the back door. The cacophony of knocks became deafening. It felt as if they were attempting to break down every door and window at once. I grasped the wrench tightly, searching for some advantage. My gaze fell upon the emergency console next to the counter, the one controlling the valves for the gas pumps. I recalled something we'd learned in training. If the main valves were closed and the pumps ceased receiving fuel, it would render the entire system inoperable for at least 1 hour. Quick, I thought. They wouldn't be able to get what they came for. Perhaps that would compel them to leave. With trembling hands, I pulled the lever that engaged the emergency lock. A mechanical click rang out, and the pumps shut off instantly. The knocking at the back door abruptly ceased for a moment. The silence that followed was far more terrifying than the noise. I then heard quick footsteps retreating, and through the cameras, I glimpsed one of the men getting back into the black van. The other two lingered by the entrance, watching me through the glass. My breathing came in irregular bursts as I contemplated my next move. It was at that moment I noticed something on the floor next to the counter. A slightly open black bag, its contents visible. I bent down without relinquishing the wrench and revealed what was inside. A phone with a live camera running. A chill washed over me. This wasn't just an attack. It was calculated. A trap designed to capture my reaction. Perhaps they anticipated that I would flee or attempt to defend myself, but now that I was aware, I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. I rose and carried the bag to the center of the store. I faced the cameras and then the men outside the glass, allowing them to see what I was doing. I ignited a lighter that I kept on the counter for customers who purchased cigarettes. The flames flickered against the black plastic of the bag. If they wanted a show, I'd give them one. I tossed the bag into a metal trash can adjacent to the counter and watched as the flames started to consume it. From behind the glass, I noticed how the men began to move anxiously. One of them attempted to open the door, but it remained locked. The other yelled something inaudible, and they both rushed toward the truck. I witnessed them scramble inside, and within seconds they sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Silence returned to the gas station, interrupted only by the crackling of the burning bag. I extinguished the fire with a fire extinguisher and checked the cameras. There was nobody else, just me left amidst a messy store and a night that seemed eternal. I picked up the phone that had been abandoned in the bag and switched it off. I didn't know who it belonged to, but my instincts told me it would be best not to keep it. When the first rays of daylight broke, I closed the store, called my supervisor, and requested a day off. I had no idea what those men were up to, but something told me they wouldn't return.